The bootlickers brought about the Empire? This is the second edition of Star Wars from 1977, specifically June 1977, which means it was the current copy when Star Wars was still just Star Wars.
An adventure unlike anything on your planet. Star Wars.
And when Star Wars was just released. And while I have more in-depth plans for all three of these novelizations, I couldn't even get through the prologue of this one without just wanting to share. I felt compelled to, before the prologue even finished, the book's opening crawl, if you will. To reiterate, this was just Star Wars. There was no hope in sight, new, old, or otherwise. The only subtitle we got, on the cover no less, From the Adventures of Luke Skywalker. This title was also on the shooting script, which at the time was actually The Adventures of Luke Starkiller. Although it's credited to George Lucas, it was actually ghostwritten by Alan Dean Foster. Foster was hired in 1975, December of that year, as the film was greenlit. Foster was not only hired to write the novelization, but hired to write 2 low-budget sequels, one of which, Splinter of the Mind's Eye, he clearly wrote, and got credit for that one. The point here isn't about Splinter of the Mind's Eye or any of that, but it's to say Star Wars was, at that time, very much a work in progress. And that's not a bad thing. We should celebrate that fact. George Lucas should have, and Disney should now. In the prologue, we get Saga 1, Saga 1. Certain words I still have trouble with, being from the woods outside of Pittsburgh. The Journal of Whills. All that good and weird stuff.
What you talking about, Whills?
The Journal of the Whills, which again was on Lucas's 4th draft from March of 1976, which was more or less the shooting script, as shooting began on March 22nd of 1976. And although the only scan I can find shows The Adventures of Luke Skywalker with a date of March 15th, 1976, Luke didn't become a Skywalker until at least sometime into the filming. Maybe as much as a month?
Mind you, for 10 weeks or however long, I don't know, let's say 4 or 5 weeks, whatever it was, from when I read it to Africa to back to England when we were shooting the main scenes, I was another name.
Mark Hamill recalled that they had to reshoot one of the most famous scenes in Star Wars when Luke meets Leia and isn't he a little short for a stormtrooper, that whole thing.
Huh?
He had to reshoot that because he says,
I'm Luke Skywalker, I'm here to rescue you.
But what he said the first time around was,
I'm Luke
Starkiller.
I'm here to rescue you.
He was a Starkiller who became a Skywalker.
I was Luke Starkiller, and that seemed to me kind of tough.
Hamill joked that it sounded like fly swatter.
And so I said, what do they change it to? Luke Skywalker.
And how, at the time, it felt not right because he'd become accustomed to Starkiller.
And I like that. And then when they said, you don't know, they don't like you having the word kill in your name. It's too negative.
And he mentioned how it just didn't sound right because he'd become accustomed to being Luke Starkiller, and to him it didn't sound right. And how now it's, for him even, it's kind of the reverse, where Starkiller just doesn't sound right. It's Luke Skywalker. I guess he just became accustomed to that very 90s comic book last name, which totally could have been an Image Comics character. I read George Lucas actually say that it was because of Charles Manson, and the implication that a dude named Starkiller would go on some intergalactic mass murder spree. I can't find the original article mentioning Charles Manson, so if you have it, please link it below. But in 2005 with Rolling Stone, he did mention the whole Starkiller Skywalker name change, but not the Charles Manson part. Now, I don't want to read the whole thing, but I mean I do, but you don't want me to read the whole thing. And the whole thing here, I just mean the prologue, let alone the whole thing. But I do have a way we can do this. Right there! George Lucas was trying to get it right. To tap into that vibe, that magic of once upon a time, but bring it into science fiction or space fantasy or whatever the proper genre is for Star Wars. Alright, can the projectionist roll it, please? So this is crazy because this actually reminds me of the prologue to a novel I wrote many years ago, but still haven't published, Personal Trauma. I've shared it some places, but that's the story for another day. But it really does. Mine started something like it was a time beyond memory or time or something. I can't quite remember what I wrote. Because my mentor, Sid Stiebel, he basically told me to throw it away after I wrote it. Not because it wasn't good, I don't know, maybe it wasn't, but the goal was to understand the history of the world, and that's what I wrote. And it took me weeks and weeks and weeks to write this thing, but I had to kind of get through my prologue to understand the setting of my story, and I think that's a little bit of what might be happening here. This prologue for Star Wars is very much a history lesson. How the Empire got to be the Empire, which may or may not be necessary, as it wasn't in my case, and may or may not be accurate anymore, because is it still canon? Is it what, legends? So my guess is it was the same for George Lucas. As he figured this whole thing out, he kind of had to go back and understand the history thoroughly. That even if maybe some of that changed as the story changed with it, which does happen, but he needed to understand where things started to get where he was going to go, even if both of those things would have changed. He had to roughly define the backstory, so he had at least a sense of how we got to Star Wars and this adventure of Luke Skywalker. Alright, hold up. And, okay, I'll stop doing that. But the Senate was wise, and the Jedi Knights protected the Republic. But wealth and power caused it to rot from the inside. Then we get what we directly see in Episode 1, where Rey's grandfather, we have to accept it, we don't own Star Wars. Mickey Mouse does. But weirdly, we all kind of now own Mickey Mouse. Anyway, Senator Palpatine got himself elected with the promise to reunite the disaffected among the people and to restore the remembered glory of the Republic, which we saw in Episode 1. That Phantom Menace of the title, that was him, which I think we've all figured that out by now. I think I just did reading this prologue. The next paragraph is key. It was the underlings, the Tarkins, these dudes that left when Darth Vader got off the elevator. They even got an action figure. Which I still want, I've never had. They control the Empire and the Emperor. I imagine it's easy to convince a crazy old man whatever you want. It's pretty easy to convince me, and I'm only moderately old. The next paragraph mentions how the Jedi Knights were eradicated, not through clones turning on them, but through treachery and deception, which could in fact be clones turning on them, I guess. But at least to me, it implies a little bit more of a slow burn for all this. With the Emperor locked away and the Imperial bureaucrats and governors running the show, we then get the rebels, starting from a small number of worlds. I will also point out the prologue refers to it as a new order, with capitals, a proper noun and not just a new order. You can't tell, but the second time I said it in lowercase. Let's return to our crawl for the last bit. We have a note from the Journal of Whills. The Whills! So this was the first saga, or saga, as I tend to say it with my natural accent breaking through. But however I pronounce it aside, the implications there are really interesting, that this is the start of it. Even though there's this backstory, this is the first story that matters in telling the story. I don't want to go into another thing, but to me that implies George Lucas's prequel idea kind of came later in the game. And maybe it was as he continued to develop all this history. He just had so much and had such a rich backstory that it made sense that that would become a thing. But again, that's my own speculation for another time, and maybe this is a place where you get some of the hints of it. The Journal of Whills goes back to possibly January of 1973, as Lucas finished American Graffiti, a film the studio kind of hated and after which Lucas was broke. THX 1138, his first attempt at science fiction, had already flopped prior to this. And even though American Graffiti would go on to be a hit, Lucas didn't know that, and he still didn't make any money. All of this is to say, George Lucas sat down, wrote down all those crazy names in something that was 2 pages long and called the Journal of Whills. There's more to all this, but my takeaway is that he kind of learned something from both of those previous film experiences that you see in Star Wars, and even in this novelization, if not the prologue. THX was cold and inhuman in some ways, but with amazing world building. And similar stormtrooper sounding noises for the cops.
Say how are you now, or have you ever been?
American Graffiti, on the other hand, was deeply human and full of character. He took that sci-fi world building of THX and combined it with American Graffiti's humanity. Or at least that's what I think. My uninformed or somewhat slightly, just a tiny bit informed opinion. So I just read a lot of stuff recently. And even if he did this, I don't know if he did it consciously. You can kind of think of it this way. THX is kind of an example of Lucas in a film doing an overly complex prologue, right? If that analogy makes sense anywhere other than in my own head. I'll save most of the Journal of Whills stuff for future videos because there's a lot to be explored there. But I need to return to the last paragraph and note that in Star Wars, I always had the feeling that the rebellion is spread really thin. It's here, there, and everywhere. It's just moving base to base as we kind of see when the Empire is chasing them. That's always how I assumed it happened, that they were kind of more on the run. But in the prologue, it states that it was a rebellion of entire worlds, entire systems. It also says that it was a bright flame of resistance in those dark days, and that light seemed likely to be extinguished until Luke Skywalker. This is his adventure after all. Just ask Willis.
What you talking about?
The Whills. We both journal. It's good. It's really therapeutic. This history feels more like some kind of ancient transcript, like that of Cicero or something from fiction like The Hobbit and Lord of the Rings. In this case, some chronicle by some forgotten world or galaxy that was later found by George Lucas and then told to Alan Dean Foster. Finally, it ends with a quote from Leia, the princess of the Ewoks. It's for my daughters. It's not really a joke, just kind of how they see her. They were in the wrong place at the wrong time. Naturally, they became heroes. Leia Organa of Alderaan. Senator. I loved reading it, but maybe it says too much. George Lucas agreed because Brian De Palma yelled at him. I might be conflating things a little bit here. But he did help rewrite the opening crawl of the film, the Flash Gordon tribute, to get us up to speed on the adventures of Luke Skywalker. Now, an opening crawl in a film isn't a prologue for a book, but it essentially functions the same. And the final version of that hits a few key points. 1, civil war and the good guys have a victory. 2, stolen plans, for the Death Star. And 3, Leia is racing home with those plans. It seems George Lucas wanted to say so much that maybe it was too much. But again, a book isn't a film, but either version kind of says too much, especially when in retrospect, the backstory changed, at least a little bit, because it's strongly implied after watching the prequel and then a sequel where he is cloned and his granddaughter's the child of clones. The Emperor was kind of in control the entire time.
I have been unnatural.
But going back to Star Wars, when it was still just Star Wars, the needs of the film were to get to the action of the film and move that action along. And for the prologue to help do that. The crawl we ended up with drove that action. I love this. I love reading this. I'm so glad it exists that I'm happy to have 2 copies. But it gives us more of a history lesson, which, good or bad, I don't know. Certainly just different. Now this video is sponsored by me. I have a Kickstarter going right now for my comic book, The Burrow, which comes from the world of my novel, The Paperboy. Now, it's all metafiction inspired by my love for things like Star Wars. This is why I do this stuff. I'm just passionate about it. And the characters in that book love it as well. It's a young adult paranormal fiction set in the 90s. Now, that's a thing, and check that out. But The Burrow itself, currently live on Kickstarter. And I'm doing a few bonuses. Now these are handmade comic book collages, and everyone who backs the next 10 from 22 on gets one of these from a selection of 14 of them total that I have behind me. So these mini collages are an added bonus to any physical level you back, no matter what it is. So please back it if you can. Now this is an example of Han Solo and the ship he pilots, the Millennium Falcon. And this is one that's unique and special for only the watchers of this video. This is the Star Wars storybook. And if you back the campaign and you are subscribed and like this video and comment below that you did in fact back the campaign, you will win this if you're the first 3 people to do so. I'm holding 2 copies in my hands, but I have a 3rd copy in my kitchen right now because I am reading through it. But I'm gonna send 3 copies of this to 3 people who back the campaign at a physical level, and also comment below that you do. And please be subscribed. That just helps me out in general. Thank you so much. I love Star Wars, and if you're new here, I didn't say I'm Josiah, and I make comic books, I write novels, I teach writing, and I just talk about this fun stuff. So thank you for spending time. If you tolerated my own self-promotion here at the end, and thank you for coming. I hope to do more videos about all this stuff. I have it planned, actually. I've been doing a lot of reading, and hopefully soon a lot of sharing with you guys. Bye.